Well, good evening. My name is Dr. Bill Gorvine, and I'm Assistant Professor in the Religious Studies Department here at Hendrix, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to a talk sponsored by the Hendrix Murphy Foundation, entitled The Life of Crime and a Life of Liberation, Murder as a Precursor to Enlightenment, by my colleague, Dr. Andrew Quintman, who has kindly joined us, and it's my pleasure to give you a short introduction and ask you to join me in welcoming him here to Hendrix. Andrew is someone who started in the field of Tibetan studies, which is also my field, in the late 1980s. He was an undergraduate at Hampshire College, which some of you may know is known as a very innovative, progressive liberal arts college in Massachusetts. During that time, he studied abroad in India and in Nepal, was bitten by the bug, lived for much of the 90s as the academic director for the SIT, School for National Training program in Nepal and in Tibetan cultural regions. He also has organized and directed programs through the University of Michigan in Lhasa and other parts of the Tibetan cultural world. He did his PhD in Buddhist studies at the University of Michigan. He also received a prestigious postdoctoral fellowship at Princeton University for 3 years, and he's now currently an assistant professor at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. So he is both a distinguished scholar and someone who has a real love for the same material and the same cultural traditions that I also share. And so it's really been great to be able to have him as a conversation partner. And I'm looking forward to hearing what he's going to share with us this evening. I did want to just ask you to feel invited, feel free to fill out response cards. And there will be time for some questions and answers at the end of his talk. So please do ask. And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Quintman, and please join me in greeting him warmly. Thanks, Andy.
Well, good evening, everyone. Is this too loud? You all can hear me, I guess. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time on campus here, so I've been very happy to have a chance to meet some of the faculty and students here. And I'm very excited to have a chance to speak with you this evening on an interesting and I hope thought-provoking and somewhat provocative topic. But before I start, I should also thank the Hendrix Murphy Foundation for the invitation. It's a great honor to be part of such a distinguished series of lecturers that the foundation has on tap for this year. I wish I could come for some of the other lectures. But I also want to thank, in particular, Henrietta Veneman, who gave me such a gracious welcome here last night and set me up here in such fine form, and also to Professor Bill Gorvine, one for his introduction, but also for making such a hospitable and sort of warm visit for me here. There's a famous teaching attributed to the 9th century Chan master Linji, and many of you are probably familiar with it. It goes like this: if you meet the Buddha, kill him. Now, to the modern ear, this might sound too cute by half, a line from the Matrix maybe. But in a traditional Buddhist context, the instruction shocks. And its shock value rests on the simple fact that killing a Buddha, or even simply drawing his blood, is considered to be the most heinous of acts, a crime incurring the worst imaginable karmic consequences. Now, of course, we know this command is not meant to be taken literally. Commentators tell us instead that the teaching encourages the practitioner to break down the reified concepts of what a Buddha, or for that matter, of what enlightenment is. Still, the path to realization is traversed by carrying out a murder, a metaphorical murder to be sure, but a murder nonetheless. Buddhism is often characterized as a religion of peace, predicated on the notion of ahimsa, or nonviolence, a tradition of tolerance, universal compassion, and loving kindness. Likewise, these qualities are usually believed to have transformed the societies in which the Buddhist teachings spread. So Tibet, for example, has long been described as an inward-looking, enlightened society, emphasizing meditation and renunciation, a Shangri-La for the mania of the modern world. And although we've come a long way toward developing a more nuanced understanding of Buddhist traditions, these kinds of descriptions continue to appear in print, penned by lazy journalists who don't know any better, and even by a few scholars who probably should. The history of Tibet's conversion to Buddhism, as narrated by indigenous authors, is indeed filled with stories of battle, conquest, and subjugation. War is likewise predicted for the future. According to the Kalachakra Tantra, an important Buddhist literary tradition that, extending back to 11th century India and still taught in Tibet, in the year 2424, a great war will erupt between the forces of good, identified in the text as proponents of the Buddhist teachings, and the forces of evil, here identified as adherents of Islam. So this great clash will be carried out by two enormous armies, although in the end, the forces of good and the teachings of the Buddha will prevail, ushering in a new age of Buddhist teaching and practice. So even a cursory examination of Buddhist literature or the political histories of Buddhist societies tell us that both texts and teachers have long struggled with the problem of violence, and in particular with the act of killing. In many such cases, these deeds are condemned outright, but in others, they are in fact justified, sanctioned, or even advocated. So this is to say that Buddhist systems of ethical conduct are more complex than expected, and are even contradictory in many circumstances. So even as they begin from the first precept forbidding murder, they address a broad range of questions. What are the consequences of killing? Is murder ever justified? And what about war? If so, when and against whom? What about slaying non-believers or enemies of the Buddhist teachings? Is there a hierarchy of victims? That is, does the crime of murdering a human being constitute a graver offense than bringing a cow to slaughter? What role does the agent's motivation play? Can you, for example, kill one for the good of many? And is intentionality an important consideration? Is it equally consequential to accidentally squash a bug on your car windshield as it is to gleefully slap the mosquito biting your arm? So there are also questions of interiorized violence, such as asceticism, not to mention suicide and forms of self-immolation witnessed recently as a form of political protest in Tibet. So finally, there are philosophical considerations, such as, why does killing matter in light of the Buddhist doctrine of emptiness that asserts the self is an illusion, and thus the person doesn't really exist in the first place? So to address these questions systematically and in detail would take an entire seminar, an entire semester. But instead tonight I want to explore one facet of Buddhist violence that is seldom recognized: the singular act of murder as it appears in the life stories of saints. And in particular, I want to look at a number of examples drawn from the Indian and Tibetan traditions. Now, the lives of saints in Buddhist Asia, like those in Christian Europe, were frequently didactic works. This is reflected in the Tibetan term for the genre of religious biography, that is namtar, which is often translated literally as complete liberation. As stories focusing on the liberation of great masters, such works present both models of and models for religious practice. But it's also clear that they served a variety of sectarian, polemical, and occasionally political agendas. But above all, they were works of literature. Although this aspect, for people working in Buddhist studies, this aspect is usually sort of undervalued. Above all, they were works of literature, and although the Buddha's would-be killer, Devadatta, who I'll speak about momentarily, is no Raskolnikov, the theme of murder struck a powerful chord for traditional Buddhist authors and for Buddhist readers, much as they did for Dostoevsky, or even the great bard himself. But before turning to the narratives and commenting on them a bit, we need to spend some time working through the definitions and interpretations of killing in the Buddhist traditions of India and Tibet. And this leads us first to the somewhat broader topic of Buddhist ethics. The framework of Buddhist ethics is multifaceted. And indeed, there's no single term that translates the full semantic category of ethics as we know it. The closest term from early canonical literature, sila, might be construed as discipline or virtuous conduct. Early Buddhist scriptures identify sila, or discipline, followed by meditation and wisdom as the three principal topics or training in practice. In Tibet, the subject of sila is often presented in the context of three levels of vows assumed either by monks or nuns or lay people or both. The first are the so-called vows of individual liberation associated with the earliest Pali texts. This tradition is sometimes called the Theravada, or tradition of elders. The second are the vows of the Bodhisattva, a term describing heroic individuals who have the intention of becoming a Buddha in order to help liberate all other beings. And this vow lies at the heart of the Mahayana, or the great vehicle tradition that appeared in India during the early centuries of the first millennium. And finally, the third set of vows appears in the esoteric tradition of the Tantras, an amalgamation of Buddhist ritual theory and practice. This tradition is sometimes referred to as the Vajrayana, or the adamantine vehicle, and it's what principally constitutes the Buddhism of Tibet. So we'll take a look at how the act of murder appears in the context of these three traditions, and I think this helps to illustrate just how complicated the subject of killing becomes. The early Pali Canon identifies 10 precepts adopted by novice monks and nuns. The first of which is the vow to abstain from killing. And this is followed by prohibitions against stealing, sexual intercourse, lying, taking intoxicants, singing and dancing, wearing perfume or ornaments, sitting on a high throne, eating after midday, or using money, literally touching gold. So these were further distilled into a five-fold set of lay precepts frequently taken by men and women alike. And again, these begin with the vow to refrain from killing, in addition to stealing, lying, sexual misconduct, and taking intoxicants. And the theory underpinning these precepts is the law of karmic causation, stipulating that virtuous actions bring about positive results in the future, such as a better rebirth or even liberation itself. And likewise, non-virtuous acts bring about negative results, such as birth in a hell realm filled with intolerable misery. The practice of sila, or discipline, embodied in the precepts is therefore predicated upon abstaining from the kinds of non-virtuous actions identified as the cause for future suffering. The act of taking another life is ubiquitously identified as a primary concern, and the condemnation of killing seems absolute. And this is clear from the Buddha's own statement in a well-known discourse called the Discourse on Brahma's Net, and I'll quote from it here. If a child of the Buddha himself kills or goads someone else to kill or provides with or suggests a means of killing, or praises the act of killing, or on seeing someone commit the act expresses approval for what the person has done, or kills by way of incantation, or is the cause, occasion, means, or instrument of the act of inducing death, he will be shut out of the community. Okay, so it seems like it's fairly cut and dry here. If there's a strict prohibition against killing, how then is the act defined? According to one famous Tibetan commentary, it refers to doing anything intentionally to end the life of another being, whether a human, animal, or another living creature. Now, first of all, we should here notice the central role of intention. The distinction between manslaughter and homicide is crucial for most Buddhist traditions, where a mens rea, a guilty mind, or criminal intent is necessary for the act to bear its fullest karmic fruit. Technical treatises in the early Buddhist scriptures often describe 4 elements necessary for an act of murder to be complete. First is the basis, which is the object to be killed, the person to be killed. Second is the intention, which is the wish to carry out the act of murder. Third, the execution, no pun intended, which is the actual physical act itself. And finally, the completion, that is the end result of a corpse. And it's usually said that an act of murder absent all 4 of those elements is incomplete. An unwitting death still carries the taint of non-virtue, but only a willful and conscientious murder exacts the heaviest karmic price. And already we start to see here a little bit of wiggle room. So we also see in this definition of killing that in accordance with general Buddhist principles, the prohibition of taking life pertains not only to humans, but to animals or any other living thing. In traditional sort of technical terms, any sentient being, that is, anything with a mind. Killing a human entails far more karmic weight than killing an animal or an insect. And commentaries typically explain that the root precept to abstain from killing is broken only when a human is murdered. But the slaughter of animals also bears karmic consequence. To paraphrase Morrissey, meat is also murder. So for this reason, the ordained communities of some Buddhist societies have favored vegetarian diets. And I say this having eaten a really wonderful steak dinner. But Tibetans, however, have a strong cultural attachment to eating meat, and we can sort of understand this living in a climate where animal products served as a staple part of their diet. And indeed, there are canonical rationalizations that quote-unquote authorize the eating of meat in Buddhist scriptures. And typically it's said that meat that has 3 characteristics is okay to eat. And that means that you don't kill the animal yourself, you don't ask someone to kill it for you, and it's not killed sort of especially for you for a sort of banquet or something like that. Which is why in Tibet, traditionally, at least in Lhasa, all of the butchers were Muslim. None of the Tibetans wanted to be butchers themselves. So moving now from the definition of killing to its consequences. From a legalistic point of view, the rules of the monastic assembly, known as the Vinaya, stipulate that killing a human constitutes a major transgression of the precepts and is grounds for expulsion from the order. Killing other kinds of animals calls for less severe punishment, such as confession before the assembly of monks or performance of expiation rites. But more pertinent to the Buddhist society at large are the karmic results of murder set forth in Buddhist scriptures. Now, all Buddhist traditions describe a cycle of existence wherein, after death, one takes rebirth propelled by the weight of one's previous actions. This is karma. Possible rebirths include an existence as a human, as an animal, or a ghost. But the Buddhist cosmos also includes a vast array of heavens and hells. Although the latter, the hell realms, are often described with a special kind of macabre enthusiasm. The theory of karmic cause and effect stipulates that a karmic result will match its original action. So a process one writer has recently dubbed the karmic fruit loop. The karmic result of murder is invariably rebirth in a hell where one is tormented for a period of time measured not in years, but in eons. The hells are uniformly grim locations, each one more terrible than the previous. There are hot hells where you are boiled in molten iron, sawed in half by demonic henchmen, crushed between giant boulders, forced to climb trees with leaves made of razor blades. There are cold hells in which you're frozen into blocks of ice and your limbs blister, crack, and then break into pieces. At the nadir of the hell realms lies the so-called hell of ultimate torment, a prison of such enduring misery that it is reserved for those who commit the 5 most egregious crimes. These are counted as killing one's father, killing one's mother, killing an arhat, who is a kind of early Buddhist saint, harming a Buddha, and creating a schism in the spiritual community. Such acts are called the 5 crimes of immediate retribution, since they ensure that one will immediately take rebirth in this lower hell. And sometimes this occurs even before one's own natural death. And we'll see an example of this shortly. It is perhaps some consolation that rebirth in a hell, even in the hell of ultimate torment, does not last for eternity. When the karmic residue of the crime that caused one to fall is exhausted, one will then take rebirth in another realm, even if it takes some 16 billion years to do so. The Mahayana, or Great Vehicle tradition of Buddhism, that began to appear around the early 1st century CE, took a significantly broader perspective on the nature of criminal acts, such as murder. The underlying principle of the Mahayana tradition is the vow of the Bodhisattva, a religious aspirant who seeks to attain liberation in order to help others to do the same. And whereas earlier traditions of the Vinaya demanded a literal adherence to the precepts, including the first one, prohibiting killing, the Bodhisattva vow emphasized the actor's compassionate motivation above all other ethical concerns. This is frequently expressed in practices that actively preserve and protect life, such as the so-called life release ritual, wherein animals condemned to slaughter are purchased and set free. And current teachers, especially Tibetan teachers, still perform this kind of practice, where they'll go to a pet store and buy crickets who would be fed to snakes, or they'll go buy earthworms and release them out into the wild. The principle underlying this new paradigm is called skillful means, the use of expedient and occasionally radical methods in the practice of compassion. The result of skillful means, the approach of skillful means allows an individual to transcend the consequences of possible ethical transgressions. He might even be permitted to kill if his motivation was ultimately to liberate beings. And in fact, the 3rd century Indian philosopher Aryadeva put it this way, quote, "Because of his or her intention, both virtue and sin are virtuous for the bodhisattva." So literally, a true bodhisattva can do no wrong. This attitude was famously set forth in several important Mahayana sutras, including the Skill in Means discourse, a text from the turn of the Common Era that uses the following well-known story to illustrate its point. And the story goes like this. A ship captain named Great Compassion, himself a bodhisattva, discovers a murderous thief on board his merchant vessel. The thief is plotting to kill his 500 fellow passengers to steal their possessions. Now, the captain finds himself here in something of a moral quandary. If he tells the merchants about the thief's plan, they will no doubt kill the thief and thereby suffer the karmic consequences of their actions, so that's no good. If he does nothing, 500 people will die, and the thief will suffer even worse karmic consequences, and that's no good either. So the captain decides that the only course of action is to kill the thief himself, which he does, fully aware of the karmic burden he must bear. In the end, importantly, but also somewhat paradoxically, the captain escapes the negative karma associated with killing and attains enlightenment as none other than the historical Buddha Shakyamuni himself. The thief, meanwhile, dies and is reborn in a heaven. So we now recognize that this story is just one instance of a much larger ethical trend within the Buddhist narrative literature, one in which the Bodhisattva transcends the apparent negativities of violence and transforms them into pure virtue. And we'll see some other examples of this shortly. While the prohibition against killing remained a foundation of Buddhist ethics, there were in fact situations when compassionate violence or ethical murder might be sanctioned as a last resort, when doing so would maximize the benefit for the greatest number of beings. According to some later commentaries, there were even instances in which it would be a sin for a bodhisattva not to kill. In the days following Osama bin Laden's death, a reporter from the LA Times asked the current Dalai Lama for a Buddhist evaluation of the plan to hunt and kill the al-Qaeda leader. And the Dalai Lama's response was perhaps not what the reporter had anticipated. As a human being, the Dalai Lama began, bin Laden may have deserved compassion or even forgiveness, a kind of standard Mahayana attitude. But the Dalai Lama continued somewhat obliquely by saying, quoting here, "Forgiveness does not mean forget what happened. If something is serious and it is necessary to take countermeasures, you have to take countermeasures." Now, whether described as a countermeasure or compassionate killing, this issue is further complicated by the introduction of Buddhist tantric literature beginning in India around the 7th century CE. Now, the subject of Tantra lies far beyond, is very interesting, but lies beyond what we have time for this evening. But I want to raise at least a few salient points. First, the Tantras greatly intensified the Mahayana's attitude toward the practice of skillful means, allowing agents to transcend normal ethical guidelines. Some tantric literature explicitly advocated transgressive behavior, including ritualized sex and violence. The litany of antinomian activities associated with its early adherents includes activities such as sleeping in cremation grounds, sex with low-caste women, eating human flesh, and, on occasion, even ritual murder. In some texts, such as the Guhya Samaja Tantra, the 5 basic precepts, that is, not to kill, not to steal, and so forth, are inverted in passages like this, and I'm quoting here. The sentient beings who kill people, who take pleasure in telling lies, who covet the wealth of others, those who enjoy constant sex, who eat feces and urine, those are worthy vessels of accomplishment. This attitude culminates in a text for repairing the tantric precepts, which includes a confession for those who have neglected their vow to kill. And it runs as follows. I confess that I have not annihilated and have been loving towards those persons who do not believe in or who despise and deprecate the Lama, the 3 jewels, that is the Buddha, his teaching, and the spiritual community, and the Vajrayana, that is the system of the Tantras itself. Now, perhaps the most famous, or the most infamous example of ritual violence are the rites of subjugation associated with, in Sanskrit, what's called the Abhichara Homa, that is the fire sacrifice conducted for the purpose of eliminating enemies, albeit through magical means and at a distance. According to one tantric text, the rites of murder should, quote, be directed for the benefit of those who deprecate the word of the Buddha, those who are inherently evil and hateful, those who hold wrong views, sinners, those who are immoral and argumentative, or those who injure the guru. Now, while the story of the captain, Great Compassion, allowed for the possibility of compassionate killing, at least in theory, the actual practice of ritual murder seems to have slowly gained acceptance in some quarters of the Tantric Buddhist world, especially when viewed as a means of safeguarding the Buddhist teachings from outside threats. In such cases, the act of murder was referred to as liberation. Literally, the term that's used is liberation, with a conceit that after death, one's enemy would be liberated into a better existence, and thus the whole world would be a better place. This notion underpinned the practice of war magic that took place in Tibet, most famously under the rule of the 5th Dalai Lama in the 17th century. Now, later commentators in Tibet debated the value of ritual violence, and there was a general trend towards internalizing what had begun as external rites. But even today, the pantheon of Tibetan Buddhist deities includes a class of wrathful figures, often depicted inside a ring of flames, bearing fangs dripping with blood, who are identified as protectors of the Buddha's teaching. And a primary ritual activity of every Tibetan monastery consists of the daily propitiation rites of the local protectors, who are called into service as a kind of local Buddhist defense force. All right, so let's take a look now at some of the ways in which murder appears in traditional Buddhist narratives. In some instances, these stories serve a clear didactic purpose as commentaries on the primacy of ethical conduct and the law of karmic cause and effect. Other examples seem to emphasize the pliable framework of Buddhist ethics and karma's limited reach. The act of murder can also appear as a precursor or even a prerequisite to liberation and enlightenment. And in the karmic aftermath of an evil deed, the actor is given a chance to prove his, and occasionally her, fortitude in applying the proper antidotes. And this, in turn, affirms the power of the Buddhist teaching. Even the most aggressive sinner can become the purest saint. Now, the Buddha himself was not free from the stain of killing. In the vast corpus of literature recording the teacher's previous lives, these are accounts known as the Jatakas or the Abhidhammas, we have several stories in which the Buddha-to-be commits murder. The Jataka tales ubiquitously begin with a kind of framing narrative in which the Buddha is seated before a group of disciples, and in order to illustrate a point of doctrine, he begins to narrate the story of one of his former lifetimes. In one account, in order to explain a slanderous charge made against him by a young courtesan, he tells the following story, which goes like this. Long ago, he was born as a handsome young street performer. He fell into a relationship with a beautiful paramour, but eventually felt jilted by his lover. In a fit of anger, then, he killed her in cold blood and then buried the corpse under the hovel of a religious mendicant. Now, the mendicant was then taken to the village square where he was about to be executed for the crime. And at the last minute, the real killer, that is the Buddha-to-be, steps forward to admit his guilt and was himself executed. Now, at the story's end, at the end of the framing tale, the Buddha goes on to tell how, as a result of this crime, he was forced to suffer many eons in a hell realm. And then he concludes by adding that the karmic effects of his murderous act lingered on even during this, his final lifetime as the Buddha, when he reveals that his former lover had been reborn as the slandering courtesan. The religious mendicant he then sort of ends with by revealing that it's actually his close disciple Shariputra. Another tale describes how in a past lifetime the Buddha killed his brother so that he might become the sole heir to his family fortune. Again, the Buddha tells how he was forced to suffer many lifetimes in hell realms for the crime. And again, he describes how the karmic effects of his past actions manifested in the present life, when a rock rolled down a hill, hit his big toe, breaking the skin and causing him to bleed. Now, both of these stories illustrate the power of karma. Murdering another human lands you in hell for a very long time. But the Buddha's act of murder also serves as a kind of rhetorical device, a biographical contrivance explaining certain imperfections or minor problems he faced during his final rebirth. His taking of another human's life serves as the karmic cause for a chain of events that extends down to his last physical existence as the Buddha, providing a new interpretive position from which to describe the body of a perfected being. Buddhist narratives describe two killers active during the life of the Buddha who stood out above all the rest. These were the celebrity murderers who made the Buddha's own past actions look amateurish in comparison. Now we'll get to the second, who is ominously named Angulimala, Mr. Necklace of Fingers, in a moment. But first there is the Buddha's cousin, Devadatta. Now, Devadatta is the quintessential wicked character in canonical Buddhist texts, where he often serves as a scapegoat for all sorts of terrible deeds. Most sources depict him as the Buddha's arch rival, driven by ambition, envy, and hatred, although a number of texts also portray him in a more saintly light. The traditional story tells how Devadatta received monastic precepts and, in fact, developed his own supernatural powers. But overcome by jealousy, he tried to convince the Buddha to step down so that he himself might lead the ordained community, a suggestion the Buddha unsurprisingly rejected. Devadatta then suggested that the Buddha change the rules of the order, stipulating, for example, and somewhat ironically, that the monks should only live as forest dwellers, that they shouldn't have a kind of monastic center, and that they should remain strict vegetarians, instead of being allowed to accept food to accept meat while they're begging alms. Once again, the Buddha declined, and Devadatta formed his own monastic assembly, thus creating a schism in the religious community. Twice shunned by the Buddha, Devadatta then devised a plan to kill the teacher in order to assume his position. So he formed an alliance, according to some sources, through his own magical powers, with a local prince, Ajatashatru, convincing him to kill his father, the great Buddhist patron, King Bimbisara. And with the king dispatched and Ajatashatru on the throne, Devadatta conspired to have the new monarch hire a gang of assassins to murder the Buddha. And this gang of assassins sort of sets forth to carry out the plan. But at the last moment, the Buddha convinced the killers to lay down their arms, and of course, typical Buddhist teaching, they all convert and become his disciples. Devadatta next attempted to dispatch the Buddha with his own hands. While the teacher was giving a discourse at Vulture Peak, Devadatta climbed to the top of the hill and hurled down a giant boulder down at the Buddha below. Well, the boulder missed, but along the way it dislodged another small stone that struck the Buddha's toe, drawing blood. And you'll remember that this is the story that was explained in the Jataka as being a karmic result of the Buddha killing his brother in a previous life. So that was strike two. Devadatta's third attempt on the Buddha's life was more creative. This time he led the fierce man-killing elephant named Nalagiri near to the Buddha, where he made it drunk with liquor. When the elephant saw the Buddha, it lowered its tusks and charged. But the Buddha tamed the beast through his power of compassion. The elephant then bowed its head and respectfully wiped the dust from the master's feet with its trunk. It then retreated with its head facing the rear so as not to turn its back on the Buddha. So strike three. It's recorded that toward the end of Devadatta's life, he developed great remorse for his misdeeds, and so he visited the Buddha seeking absolution. Yet not only had he lived a life of crime and of murder, or at least attempted murder, he had committed 3 of the 5 acts of immediate retribution. And first he was implicated in the patricide of Ajatashatru. Second, he was guilty of creating a schism in the monastic community. And third, he drew the blood of a Buddha. So in a scene worthy of a Cecil B. DeMille film, in the moment before reaching the Buddha, tradition tells us that the earth opened up and swallowed Devadatta whole, casting him into the lowest hell of ultimate torment for hundreds of thousands of eons. And yet, even so, it was prophesied that he too would eventually become an accomplished saint far in the future. We find a similar tale of conversion and redemption in the life story of Angulimala, Mr. Bearer of the Necklace of Fingers. The story of Angulimala appears in numerous early canonical sources. At the time of his birth, it said that he was prophesied to become an outlaw, and this was confirmed by a series of bad omens that appeared, such as the flashing of weapons in the city. This led Angulimala's father, a Brahmin priest, to name the boy Ahimsaka, or harmless. Now already the child is presented as a kind of anti-Buddha, whose own biographies describe a miraculous birth accompanied by auspicious signs and prognostications. As a young man, Angulimala went to study under an acclaimed Brahmin priest, where he excelled at his studies. The other pupils became jealous of this, and so tried to turn their master against him by accusing Angulimala of various crimes. The master then prematurely ended Angulimala's training and demanded a parting gift, which is indeed a traditional practice, although the gift itself was anything but ordinary. He asked for 1,000 fingers, each taken from the hand of a different victim. And the teacher assumed that in the process of trying to collect all of these fingers that Angulimala would be killed himself. Now the sources disagree on Angulimala's motivation for the crimes he followed. Some point to his unwavering devotion to his guru, which is itself considered a virtue. Most, however, ascribe them to a naturally violent disposition developed over the course of many past lifetimes. In any case, Angulimala set forth on a life of murder. He spent his days murdering pilgrims and merchants as they passed through isolated places, through the forest and so forth, severing a finger from each of their right hands. As news of his actions spread, the travelers began to avoid the roads, and then Angulimala would enter the villages and drag his victims from their own homes. As his stock of fingers increased, he eventually strung them on a thread, forming a giant necklace of fingers that earned him his gruesome name. He was, in the words of one canonical text, brutal, bloody-handed, devoted to killing and slaying, showing no mercy to living beings. He was a nasty character. As word of Angulimala's actions spread, the local people themselves vowed to kill him. His mother learned of the plot of the villagers and set out to warn her son. At the same time, the Buddha, who was residing nearby, perceived through his own clairvoyance that Angulimala had in fact killed 999 people and was searching for his 1,000th victim. And the Buddha further understood that if the mother encountered him first, he would slay her as his final victim and would fall into the hell of ultimate torment for committing the crime of matricide. If, however, he, the Buddha, encountered Angulimala first, the brigand would become a monk and would attain nirvana. So you probably know where this is going. The mother and the Buddha reached Angulimala at the same moment. And first Angulimala moved to kill the mother, but then was distracted by the presence of the Buddha and moved to slay him instead. He drew his sword and charged at the Buddha. Yet as the text describes, and I'm quoting here, the Blessed One willed a feat of psychic power such that Angulimala, though running with all his might, could not catch up with the Blessed One, walking at a normal pace. And so stunned was Angulimala that he shouted at the Buddha, "Stop!" And the Buddha replied, "I have stopped, Angulimala. You stop." And the text here, of course, is using a kind of play on the word stop, meaning both the literal, don't chase me, but also the metaphysical, stop your worldly, non-virtuous actions. Seeing the Buddha's miraculous display of power and hearing his voice, Angulimala repented his former ways, vowed to cease his life of crime, and took the vows of a monk as the Buddha's disciple. Around that time, another of the Buddha's royal patrons, King Prasanajit, came to see the Buddha, where Angulimala, now a monk, was also seated. The king expressed his intention to hunt down and kill the nasty mass murderer, not knowing what had just happened. Yet without giving away the surprise, the Buddha replied, "Great king, suppose you were to see Angulimala with his hair and beard shaved off," wink, wink, nod, nod, "wearing the ochre robe, having gone forth into homelessness, refraining from killing. What would you do to him?" And to this the king replied, "We would bow down to him, or rise up to greet him, or offer him a seat." The king then asks the Buddha what I think forms the crux of this entire story, when he says, "But how could there be such virtue and restraint in an unvirtuous evil character?" Well, the Buddha then reveals Angulimala, who's been seated beside him all along, and the king, true to his word, paid homage to the newly ordained monk. And the king answers his own question moments later when he states, "It is amazing, Lord, it is astounding how the Blessed One has tamed the untamed, pacified the unpacified. For what we could not tame, even with blunt or bladed weapons, the Blessed One has tamed without blunt or bladed weapons." The laws of karma may be inexorable, but there is no sinful deed so great that it cannot be overcome by the practice of virtue. The story becomes a kind of parable for the power of truth over blemishes of character, in which the Buddhist path is open to all, not just a few holy exemplars, but the flawed, confused, immoral, ordinary masses, even a deviant like Angulimala. Now, the act of murder can establish a kind of pivot point for entering the religious life, one that can eventually lead to liberation. This was Angulimala's redemption. And the trope also appears in the life story of Tibet's greatest saint, Milarepa. So this figure, an 11th century mendicant and poet, universally renowned in the Tibetan Buddhist world as the Lord of Yogins, is esteemed through the Himalayan Buddhist world as an exemplary religious figure. His Vita, ubiquitously known as the Life of Milarepa, is a tale that has long served as a model for religious virtuosi on the Himalayan plateau, as a record of the birth of a religious tradition and the founding of its lineage, a dramatic account of an individual life of solitude and contemplation. It is a narrative that has become ingrained within Tibet's religious landscape, a real touchstone for the entity we now call Tibetan Buddhism. And I think it's not exaggerating to say that the Life of Milarepa is the most famous book in Tibet. Not that I'm the most objective person to make that claim. The themes principally associated with this story, purification of past misdeeds, faith and devotion to the Guru, ardor and meditation, and the possibility of attaining liberation in a single lifetime, had a profound impact on the development of Buddhism across the region. And it should not surprise us too much to find that his religious vocation was predicated on the mass murder of his family. The Life of Milarepa describes how he was born to a prosperous family in southwestern Tibet. His father died while Milarepa was still a young boy, so together with his mother and sister, he was forced to live under the care of his paternal aunt and uncle. Although the father's will, Milarepa's father's will, stipulated that his estate should return to the boy upon reaching majority, the uncle and aunt, who are portrayed in the text as just incredibly selfish and greedy, instead seized the considerable possessions for themselves, forcing young Mila and his family to live a life of abject poverty. For years, they lived as servants for the aunt and uncle, dressed in rags, fed meager provisions, and worked to the bone. Prompted by his mother's insistence, the boy set out to train in black magic and hail-making in order to avenge his family's treatment. And I'll read to you just a small passage in which the mother is sort of presenting her view of what she would like his son to do in order to exact revenge on their family. "I would like to see you, Milarepa, in a fine cloak, mounted upon a horse with your stirrups slashing the throats of our hated enemies. Such will not come to pass, yet success is still possible by means of treachery. So I would like you to train to become an expert in black magic, curses, and casting hail. Then you should destroy all of those who inflicted misery on us, villagers and countrymen, beginning with your uncle and aunt, cutting off their family lines for 9 generations." Well, Milarepa goes out to try and fulfill her wishes, the good son of a mother that he is. When he reaches central Tibet, Milarepa encountered a number of teachers renowned for their skill in the arts of black magic. He first received instruction on a particular wrathful tantric practice that kills at a distance. And this is described as the black magic rite called the Zadong Marnak, the dark red-faced Za, which is one particular wrathful deity, that kills with the syllable hum and causes unconsciousness with the syllable pe. He applies himself to its practice, and after 14 days, a group of wrathful protector deities appear carrying 35 severed human heads, dripping blood. The deities say, "For some days you have called upon us, and this is just what you've asked for." And then they pile the heads and the still beating bloody hearts on the floor. So meanwhile, the story then sort of gives us a flashback and to describe the effects of black magic that have taken place in Mila's homeland. And it's described this way. So the setting is a wedding celebration that's taking place at the home of the uncle and aunt. So the house that Milarepa had sort of been brought up in. And the text says, "A former servant of mine," of Milarepa, so Milarepa is narrating the story, "a former servant of mine who now worked for my uncle and aunt went to draw water. She did not see the many horses tethered in the courtyard, but instead saw it filled with scorpions, spiders, snakes, tadpoles, and the like. In their midst stood a scorpion as big as a yak, thrusting its claws around a pillar and tearing it out. She fled in terror, and just as she landed outside, the many stallions that were tethered together with the mares riled the females, causing all of the horses to startle and rear, while the mares kicked at the stallions. Pillars were struck and they toppled. The house collapsed, and under the rubble, some 35 people died, including my uncle's sons and their wives. The house was filled with corpses and shrouded in a swirl of dust." So quite an evocative picture he paints there. The surviving relatives then conspired to kill Milarepa's mother, and so in retaliation, Milarepa once again returns and by magical means causes a great hailstorm to rain down, laying waste the countryside, the entire village, and all of its newly ripened crops. Milarepa might therefore be described as Tibet's first homegrown terrorist, although I'm not sure he's ever been explained in exactly those terms. Eventually, Milarepa grew concerned about the looming effects of such terrible deeds. He met a guru who subjected him to the most brutal training regimen imaginable, forcing him to undertake a series of extensive construction projects by himself, carrying rocks and mortars on his own back until his body broke out in festering sores. This was a labor that took many, many years. He was, in fact, driven to the point of suicide. But in the last moment, his teacher reveals that all of these acts were actually a form of purification, a kind of skillful means, if you will, of purifying, of absolving Milarepa from the karmic consequences of the negative deeds that he had performed earlier in his life. And thereafter, Milarepa is said to have spent the rest of his life practicing meditation in isolated mountain caves and teaching small groups of disciples through his own songs of realization and poetry. Now, the earliest versions of Milarepa's life story barely mention the murder that he committed early in his life. The gruesome scenes of his early transgressions appear only in the standard version of his life story that I quoted from here. This is the version which everyone in Tibet knows and was written some 400 years after his death. So this is to say that the story of mass murder was intentionally highlighted in this classic tale. So luckily, we have a record of the author's intention in composing this work. And he gives us a couple of clues to understand why he might have done this. He says, one, he wanted to craft an absorbing story. He wanted a captivating, sort of gripping tale. But more importantly, he wanted to create a story that would appeal to all members of society, from the powerful and arrogant monarch to educated monks and nuns to the ordinary villagers. And in this sense, with the crimes of his youth, Milarepa becomes a kind of Buddhist everyman. Right? He's not some miraculous emanation of a Buddha appearing to take human birth as a kind of theater performance, which is in fact how the Buddha's life is sometimes described. Rather, he is every Tibetan. He's all Tibetans, and no act is so evil as to make him irredeemable. So to make just a couple of brief points in conclusion here, I want to note that Buddhist accounts of murder seem to illustrate the expediency of the Buddhist teachings. Right? So while there may be a strong ethical imperative, there are few moral absolutes. And moreover, the stories of murder teach that the laws of karmic cause and effect are infallible, but they also illustrate the means for eradicating or at least purifying negative karma, as we've seen with Milarepa's trials. But finally, the tales of murder have a value even beyond their didactic utility. That is, they provide a sense of the fictional power of Buddhist literature. Now, fictional in this sense, in this context, doesn't refer to a story's falsity, but rather to its forming or shaping or molding elements, that is, the crafting of narrative. And it is this fictive power of the story which I think ultimately provides us with a coherent vision of the life. Now, at the start of my talk, I mentioned a great clash of civilizations, pitting Buddhist warriors against the horde of non-believers, prophesied to take place some 4 centuries in the future. And this is a great mythic account associated with the tantric system known as the Kala Chakra, or the Wheel of Time. And the Dalai Lama regularly conducts these rituals in public forums around the world. He's done it probably close to 3 dozen times now. Now, Tibetans commonly say that attending such a ritual, guarantees rebirth into the Buddhist army that will battle these forces of evil. Yet, the many Western followers who attend these rituals seem largely unaware of this violent side of the story. Many are instead drawn to the event for its broad universalistic appeal. And indeed, the ritual, which was last held at the Verizon Center in Washington, D.C. this past summer, is often billed, and somewhat ironically, as the Kala Chakra for world peace. Murder, it seems, may be a precursor to enlightenment for us all. Okay, so I think I'll stop there, and I would be more than happy to take questions or comments from you all.
Well, it may fall to me to ask some questions, but thank you very much
Sure.
for a really compelling, intriguing presentation. One thing in class, we've been reading Dr. Quintman's translation of Milarepa's life, and I found myself interested in the moral culpability of the villagers in the context,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
The aunt and uncles, perhaps they're extended relatives, maybe they're merely complicit in looking away from what was going on, the sort of economic injustice.
Right.
They end up victims of hailstorms.
That's right.
Kind of, I know there's ideas of collective karma
Yeah,
in
right.
Tibetan tradition. Could you say something about how that might complicate ethical thinking?
Yeah, that's a good question, and in a sense, you may have touched upon it yourself. This idea of collective karma, that individuals each have their own sort of karmic stream, if you will, which is the culmination or the combination of all of the acts that they've performed up until this lifetime or even within this lifetime. But then there's also a sense of shared karma, in which people who are brought together or who are sort of find themselves together share some kind of karmic connection which has brought them to that same place and same time. And that the actions that occur to them, or the things that happen to them collectively, arise out of the sort of collective combination of their own karma. And so in some sense, you can say that the villagers whose crops were wiped out or whose houses were wiped out or who were in fact just blatantly murdered were somehow all tied together in the kind of same karmic web. Right? I've visited the village in which Milarepa lived and talked to the villagers there, and what's interesting is that he's still revered as a great saint. It's not like anyone there holds a grudge against him, right, for wiping out their village. Right? He's still seen to be the sort of paramount kind of religious figure that everyone else in Tibet sees him as. Other questions? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Well, we don't know much about the secular law from the time when Milarepa was alive. But even looking, in the 20th century, we were talking at dinner about kind of Chinese propaganda now about the liberation of the poor Tibetan serfs. And one of the pieces of propaganda that they often use are photographs of tortures of punishment that were meted out to people, sort of ordinary people, for crimes of theft or murder or what have you. And they were extremely severe. I mean, we have even now eyewitness accounts of, one of the most gruesome I can think of, which I believe was a punishment for murder, was they would take the two bones from the spinal column of a yak, so like two kind of pieces of yak bone, and they would place them on your temples, and they would tie a band of leather around those two, and then they would have like a kind of crank, and they would tighten it and tighten it and tighten it until your skull crushed. There was another punishment in which you were literally sewn up alive inside a yak hide and tossed into the river to drown. So we know that punishments could be quite severe. I mean, people would sometimes have their hands or legs cut off, would be put in stockades and things like that. So life was certainly not rosy. There are people who are now trying to sort of tease out what the sort of secular sort of laws would have been, the kind of royal laws going back to the 7th century, which is more or less the beginning of recorded history in Tibet. But it's something which we still don't have a very clear picture of. There's a famous, one of Tibet's most famous modern poets. In fact, he's often called the first Tibetan modernist, a man named Gendon Chupel, who lived in the early part of the 20th century. I think he died in 1947, maybe. Was born a monk, was a brilliant scholar, eventually gave up his monastic vows, wandered around India for close to 12 years, was a brilliant author, was an artist and a poet, but he was also a sort of drunk and kind of a lech. In fact, he wrote a version of kind of a Tibetan version of the Kama Sutra, so a treatise on sexuality, which he claims in his preface to have been based on his own firsthand research. He traveled around India for many years, and when he came back, he had started writing a history of Tibet, a kind of religious and political history of Tibet. But it was written from, as of then untapped sources, and it was not a history that sort of towed the standard line. It didn't paint the Tibetan government in a very pretty light. And he was, in fact, imprisoned by the Tibetan government, and we think it was largely because of the writing project that he had adopted. He actually writes, he's written poetry about his time in the dungeons of the Potala Palace. So the Potala Palace is the winter palace of the Dalai Lamas, this incredible sort of 1,000-roomed building, one of the largest buildings in the world when it was constructed. Actually has dungeons down below it, and he wrote quite evocatively about his time there. So we know that punishments could be quite severe. So there was another question somewhere. Yes? Mm-hmm. 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 Right, well, I guess in a sense, this was the sort of central question that I was hoping to raise, that we have a sort of picture of what we imagine Buddhism to be and what the Buddha taught, but we find in practice things are often quite different. But what I was trying to sort of tease out a little bit is that even in the teachings of the Buddha himself, there are questions of what's considered ethical and what's not. Right? So I think it's a very complicated question. In some sense, I think you can say that Buddhist societies were always involved in violence. Right? It's a very different picture than we like to believe, but we know this was true in India, this was true in China, it was certainly true in Japan even up until the early modern period, and it was certainly true in Tibet, however much people tried to deny that fact or to gloss over that fact. Does war predicated on the Buddhist teaching, say, in defense of Buddhism, against a perceived enemy of Buddhism, is that in line with the Buddhist teachings? Many of us would probably say, no, it's not. Right? But, I mean, I think we can't deny that such things actually took place. Right? And this is true of every religious tradition. It's a difference between the sort of prescriptive and descriptive understanding of what the traditions tell us, right? What's written in the text versus what we actually see happening on the ground. Yes?
In your talk, there were kind of, for me, two strands.
Yeah.
And one of them talked about traditions that valorized murder.
Right.
I guess that would be a tantric strand. And the other tended to say murder is actually not such a good thing, but it's human.
Mm-hmm.
And there's redemption from that.
That's right.
Even though it's not to be valorized.
Mm-hmm.
And at face value, those are kind of in tension,
Mm-hmm.
to my mind, with one another.
Mm-hmm.
Valorization of murder.
Right.
And redemption of murder.
Right.
What this leads, so one is to speak
Yeah.
to that.
Yeah.
But there's a quick background question here.
Yeah.
We speak of Buddhism as if it's singular.
Yeah, that's right.
And your talk makes me wonder if it might not be more accurate to say Buddhism's
Oh, absolutely.
and to recognize that
Yeah.
there's actually deep tension
Yeah.
within the multiplicity of traditions
Mm-hmm.
that we maybe misname
Mm-hmm.
collectively Buddhism.
Right. That's your second point is very well taken. In fact, this is usually the first thing I say in the beginning of every class I ever teach, right? Is that Buddhism itself is an invention. Buddhism as such never existed. There's no word for Buddhism in any canonical Buddhist language. Okay? And that we can't really talk of Buddhism as a kind of monolithic, singular thing. We really have to understand Buddhisms as kind of uniquely, historically, and geographically located traditions, which are all quite distinct from one another. So I think absolutely, it's absolutely true. Although I did I hope that I gave some flavor of that in posing these sort of three sets of vows, which is how Tibetans tend to kind of organize discussions of the historical progression of Buddhism, sort of in tension with one another. To get to your first question, The real problem here that you've identified is the valorization of violence in Tantra. And our central problem there is all we have are the texts. So we have the early Indian Tantras, and if you read the texts, it says things like, kill your mother, kill your father, kill your father, sleep with your mother. There are rites of murder, of subjugation, and so-called liberation. But we have no idea how they were actually understood or practiced. And that it's very difficult to know how literally those practices were taken. And what we do find is that as they are translated and absorbed into the Tibetan tradition, there's actually strong debate over exactly that point. How there are some early commentators who seem to say, well, no, these are to be taken literally. But the move over time, especially by the time you reach, say, the 13th, 14th century, is that almost all of those sort of outer rituals, this kind of idea of outer literal violence becomes internalized, right? Or becomes focused on a kind of effigy, right, instead of an actual person. And this is true for the sort of violent side. It's also true for the kind of sexuality of Tantra, where it's mostly understood as a kind of internalized ritual as opposed to an externalized physical ritual. But I don't disagree that there is a kind of tension between them. The topic of Buddhism in violence and of Tantra more generally is kind of a hot topic now, and there are quite a few people who are working on exactly this topic. And they're working with materials that have early kind of tantric materials that have never been studied before. And I think the general consensus is that in the early phase, it seems that these sorts of practices may have been understood literally, taken literally, but very quickly they were sort of transformed into kind of an internalized, interiorized practice. Yeah. Sure. Right. Yeah, right, 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 right. Right. Did you ask a similar question in class today? We were talking with something kind of similar. I think. Sure. So the question is why in the story of Angulimala, the redemption, if you will, the purification sort of happens in a moment. He meets the Buddha and suddenly he's converted and he becomes a monk and sort of everything is fine. Right? Although it said that actually I left out part of the Angulimala story, which is towards the end of his life, he's actually beaten to a bloody pulp, right, on the verge of death with his head sort of cracked open. And this is the kind of coming to fruition of the acts that he had performed earlier in his life. So he's not sort of completely absolved of the misdeeds that he had done early on. But in the story of Milarepa, where there's this incredibly moving, sort of evocative description of the toil of the physical, but especially the emotional, sort of internal toil that he's forced to undergo by his teacher, is almost entirely absent from other versions of Milarepa's life. So that aspect of the story, and others, like the early practice of magic, are, I won't say inventions, but they're creations of this particular author. And so the question becomes, why did he include those episodes? And I mean, I hesitate to say that he invented them out of whole cloth. It's difficult to know, well, I mean, basically know virtually nothing at all about who the historical figure Milarepa was. I'm sure he had reasons, maybe based on oral tradition or something, to sort of include those stories. But I think it really tells a very powerful and very human tale. I think he really sort of invests the story with a kind of emotion that resonates with readers, right? I mean, we know that the author of the life of Milarepa wanted to create a story, wanted to tell a story that would connect with his readers, that would affect his readers in a really sort of deeply emotional and powerful way. And I think it's by showing the kind of interior emotional life of Milarepa, who first is forced by his mother into, these just like horrific acts of violence, right? And then later on is forced to suffer kind of immeasurably at the hand of his teacher in order to purify those sins, and then goes off to undertake incredible austerities of living for years and years on nothing but boiled nettles, right, while he's meditating in solitude, creates a very powerful and moving story, right? And what's interesting is that, I have a new project in trying to understand Tibetan literature as literature. So for people who work in my field of Buddhist studies or Tibetan studies, who are interested in Tibetan texts, be it philosophical texts or narratives, have had a sense that texts, that these stories are sort of data to be mined, right? That we can learn about Buddhism, of Buddhist doctrine, or we can learn about history, or we can learn about social culture or whatever. But the one thing that we haven't really done much of is understand these stories as a kind of literature that have the same kind of literary conventions that the great poets and great authors of our own culture have used. And it's one of the things that me and a group of other people who work in Tibetan literature are trying to think about. What makes a great story in Tibetan? What are the components that make a good plot, that develop a kind of pacing, right? That develop characters, that develop a sense of kind of an interiority of a character as opposed to kind of a flat, sort of stock figure, right? And I think all of these things are really present in the life of Milarepa. And I think it's one of the reasons why the life of Milarepa became so famous in Tibet. I think it's one of the reasons why Tibetans love the story. The life of Milarepa was also one of the first Tibetan texts that was translated into English and studied by scholars in the West. And I think one of the reasons why it sort of caught on, and one of the reasons why it's still taught in undergraduate college classes, is because it has something of that. It has a kind of novelistic feel to it, right? It has fully developed characters. It has incredible tension. It has an incredible emotional tone. And so much of that is due to these sorts of story elements. And the one thing I'll add, and then I'll shut up. We also find elements in stories such as the life of Milarepa, which really have no didactic value whatsoever. Okay, we often think of, the lives of saints are meant to teach us what a saintly life is like, right? What its result is, but also to show us the path to get there, to give us a kind of blueprint to follow ourselves. But I think if we look carefully, we find in stories like the life of Milarepa, there are elements in there that really have no didactic value whatsoever, right? Like there's a great story in the life of Milarepa where he and a partner have conspired to cast the kind of magic of hailstorms back in Mila's village. And then the kind of local villagers kind of discover them and they come to chase them, and so they decide that we're going to split up because two people will be harder to catch separately than together. But we're going to meet, a week from now in this one village, so let's meet there. And the companion comes and is looking for Mila and doesn't see him, and finally he talks to the innkeeper and says, have you seen this guy? He's got long hair and so on and so forth. He says, oh yeah, well there's a whole gathering of these kind of yogi types down in this other village where they're all drinking beer. You should go there and see if he's there. And by the way, if you don't have a cup, I'll lend you my cup. And this cup is a beautiful cup. It's dark ashen like the face of the Lord of Death himself, and it's smooth on the inside, and you should take this cup and go and drink it. And this is like just a funny, it's a funny little detail, but it's so Tibetan, and it just kind of, gives a certain spark to that element. And then he goes and he meets Milarepa. He says, well, why weren't you here? I was waiting for you. What happened? And Mila says, oh, well, I was actually bitten by a dog, and my leg hurt so badly, I was delayed by 4 or 5 days. I mean, this teaches us nothing about what it's like to practice Buddhism, about what it's like to be a saint, to become a Buddha. Right? What it does is it gives us this very interesting kind of fully fleshed encounter. Right? Okay. Yeah, well, thank you all.